Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The third impossible. Two examples presented in some treatises that will explain this impossible. The first example: a very wild man entered a palace built and erected in an empty desert, completed and adorned with all the works of civilization. He looked inside and saw thousands of regular artful objects. Due to his wildness and foolishness, he begins to search by assuming that one of the objects inside the palace, without anyone from outside interfering, made the palace with all its components. Which object does he look at? Even his wild mind cannot conceive that object could make these things. Then he sees a notebook inside the palace, in which the palace's organizational program, the list of existing things, and the laws of administration are written. Even though that notebook, being handless, eyeless, and hammerless, has no ability, like the other things inside, to organize and adorn the palace. But being compelled by necessity, in comparison to other objects, and as in title of scientific laws, he sees this notebook as related to the whole of the palace and says, "It is this notebook that organized, arranged, made, installed, and placed these objects," thus turning his wildness into the raving of fools and drunkards. There were these three words. The first is the apparent causes, ifchatul esbab. The second is self-formation, teshekubisihi. And the third is borrowing from nature, ikrazatul tabiyat. 3 points for each word. This is the third point of the third word. It's ending now, meaning the points are ending. He left the very last one for this. So, for example, when a person understands the matter of laws step by step, the first thing that is easiest to understand is that it cannot be by chance. For example, everyone can immediately understand that the wind blowing randomly around this building and the stones coming together on top of each other to form such a building will not happen immediately. So he solves that in the first point. He passes over that. He now passes over the causes. So he comes to the conclusion that causes cannot do it by themselves. Then he beautifully explains in the second word, referring to the particles and cells in the human body working by themselves, God forbid, their order, regularity, wisdom, movements, etc. After explaining these, he says, these are unconscious particles. How can they perform conscious actions? He finishes that too. At the very end, he comes to the matter of nature. The last stronghold is nature. In the first and second points, after explaining that nature, meaning what we call the nature of things, cannot replace God's knowledge and power. It cannot influence like someone with knowledge and power, and such a thing cannot be expected from it. He finally comes to the point called laws. This is the very last one. Once a person understands this, the matter is resolved. There is nothing else left. So that's why this is the most difficult to understand, but also the most enjoyable part to solve. The person who understands this has resolved all the issues. That's why let me read this part one more time. How does the master resolve it? How does he solve the matter? The first example. A very wild man entered a palace built and erected in an empty desert, completed and adorned with all the works of civilization. He looked inside. He is describing the palace. Let's say a palace in the middle of an empty desert, an empty field. But what kind of a palace? Completed and adorned with all the works of civilization. It's not just something made of 4 walls. Whatever works of civilization exist, it is equipped with all of them. It is completed with all of them, meaning it has been brought to the point of perfection. Tekmil means brought to perfection. An elevator is installed, air conditioning is installed, lighting systems are done, heating systems, ventilation, etc. A palace equipped with everything most perfect that we can imagine. And it is also adorned, meaning the walls are not just plain white. There are flowers, insects, all sorts of decorations, paintings, etc., like this. Perhaps every stone is engraved with as much detail as a palace. Such a palace, both completed and adorned, built and erected in an empty desert. A very wild man entered and looked inside. The master's use of the word wild here is very wise. It means that the person who will think about and understand these matters needs to have a subtle mind and a sensitive perspective. For example, he says coarse next to wild. Then, for example, if we think about the eye, there is an eye that can see even the smallest lines. There is an eye that can only see a certain size. It can only see if it wears glasses. So the eye sees coarse, large things. It cannot see small things, details. The mind is also like this. It cannot see subtle meanings, the difference between subtle meanings. It cannot distinguish between law and power. It cannot distinguish between art and the artist. It cannot see such subtle meanings. That's why he calls him wild. Because he is wild, he cannot see mentally. So the meaning of wildness is this. Wild means living in the mountains. The opposite of wild is civilized. Civilized means living in the city. A person living in the city is superior to someone living in the mountains. Why? Because the mountain dweller lives by himself. The city dweller can also think about others. He can think about the rights of others. He is for example, if a wild man enters traffic, he only thinks of himself. He doesn't give way to anyone. He just says, I exist. But a civilized person says, others are also on this road with me. He thinks about their rights too. He has a more advanced level of understanding. So when he says wild, it's not in a derogatory sense, but rather that he doesn't know rights. He doesn't know how to live with other people. The mind hasn't developed yet, for example. But when the mind develops a little more, he can think about other people too. The issue here is that he doesn't know what art is, what the artist is, what knowledge is, what power is, what is this, what is that. For example, when a person is considering the cause of a work, what should be the cause of a work? I mean, to what can you attribute something and to what can you not? These are all matters of comprehension. The wild man cannot comprehend these things. For example, a person says, physical and chemical laws govern this universe. For example, they actually use this sentence. Physical and chemical laws govern this universe. Now, what kind of mental capacity can a person who says this have? Can a law govern a place? It is governed according to a law. That is, the governor is separate. The governor governs. And while governing, he governs according to laws. A law doesn't govern. A law, what you call a law or a rule, is not a personality with such power and might. It is the habit of the governor while governing. For example, what can't the person do? For example, he is not aware of what a law is. For example, this is what the master calls wild. So when he says wild, he expresses this. This is what these people are like, this wild man. A wild man entered and looked inside. He saw thousands of regular artful objects. He enters the palace. What does he see? He saw thousands of regular artful objects. Due to his wildness and foolishness, he begins to search by assuming that one of the objects inside the palace, without anyone from outside interfering, made the palace with all its components. Now, normally, if you saw a palace, you would search for the master of this palace, right? I mean, first you might say the master of this palace could be inside. If you don't know anything, he could be inside or outside. You would look at the first possibility, right? I mean, inside or outside. He says that entering the matter directly by saying, I will not search outside, I will search for its master inside, is what? He says it's due to his wildness and foolishness. For example, science, scientists, heretics, disbelievers, infidels, etc. They say, we will explain everything without mentioning God, they say. That's how the person starts. You can't start like that. For example, what are you doing? You are skipping a step. So what should you say? I will look at this palace. If this palace describes a master in such a way, if the cause describes a cause in such a way, if I see this cause inside, I will attribute it to that. If I see it outside, I will attribute it to that. So entering the matter in such a conditional way is meaningless. So what is it? That's why he says, due to his wildness and foolishness, without anyone from outside interfering, he eliminates the correct answer at the beginning. Then he is forced to choose a wrong one from among the wrong ones. Then he chooses the most suitable one. But still he has lost the correct one once. To see, well, here of course we can ask such a question. Why did he start in such a conditional way? Well, perhaps he didn't want to see. There could be other reasons. There are many things related to this in the Risale-i. It says that within every sin, there is a path leading to disbelief. For example, if a person has committed a sin, he is inclined to deny a being who sees him and who, he says, for example, it could be because of that, or there could be other reasons. There are many things in the Risale-i, but let's not go there here. Here, what does he say? He says, due to his wildness and foolishness. In short, there is a wildness, there is a foolishness. He begins to search by assuming that one of the objects inside the palace, without anyone from outside interfering, made the palace with all its components. Now he walks around inside the palace. Which object does he look at? Even his wild mind cannot conceive that object could make these things. For example, suppose he sees this cupboard. Did the cupboard make this building? He asks. He looks and says, no, it can't. He moves on and sees the clock. For example, did the clock make it? He says, no, the clock can't. So which object does he look at? Even his wild mind cannot conceive that object could make these things. In any case, his mind does not consider that object sufficient. Then he sees a notebook inside the palace in which the palace's organizational program, the list of existing things, and the laws of administration are written. What does he see in the palace? He comes across a notebook. What is written in the notebook? He sees a notebook in which the palace's organizational program, the list of existing things, and the laws of administration are written. Look, 3 things. The list of existing things, then the organizational program, the list of existing things, the laws of administration. These 3 things complete each other anyway. For example, what does a person do? First, he builds a palace, right? How is that palace built? Organizational program. Organizational building means something's, for example, how is a building built? It's built according to a program. What is done? The foundation is laid, the formwork is nailed, the rebar is placed, concrete is poured, etc. Right? It's built according to a program. It's not built randomly. So there's an organizational program. Or if we think of the creation of a human being, a human is not created like that. There's DNA, there are codes in the DNA. It is looked at there, it is copied from there, etc. So there is a chain of events. The organizational program is written. Then the list of existing things. What is in that? What is there? How many windows are there? How many doors are there? How many refrigerators are there? Etc. There's a list of existing things. And then the laws of administration. How does life continue in that? How is the palace administered? Heating, cooling, eating, lighting, etc. The formation of that palace, of course. Its creation. What will be placed inside that palace? Then how will they be managed? So there are already three things. So he sees a notebook in which the organizational program, the list of existing things, and the laws of administration are written. Even though that notebook, being handless, eyeless, and hammerless, has no ability like the other things inside to organize and adorn the palace. Okay? These things are written in this notebook. But the stones of this palace will be placed, the doors will be nailed, the windows will be installed, the lamps will be... How will this notebook do this? Meaning the notebook has no power, no might, no hammer, no hand, no eye. So, okay, these things are written, but a power is needed for this palace, a capacity for action is needed. So he sees that even though that notebook, being handless, eyeless, and hammerless, has no ability like the other things inside to organize and adorn the palace. It's no different from the others, he says. Just as they can't do it, this can't either. He sees that too, but he says, but being compelled by necessity. Why is he compelled? Because he has to find something. He has to base it on something. You rejected the correct answer from the start. So you are forced to say something. Let's at least make this the object of worship. Let's believe in this. Being compelled by necessity in comparison to other objects, as a title of scientific laws, he sees this notebook as related to the whole of the palace and says, it is this notebook that organized, arranged, and adorned the palace and made, installed, and placed these objects, thus turning his wildness into the raving of fools and drunkards. In comparison to other objects, as a title of scientific laws, he sees this notebook as related to the whole of the palace, because this notebook has everything written about the palace. And so he says it is this notebook that organized, arranged, and adorned the palace, and made, installed, and placed these objects, thus turning his wildness into the raving of fools and drunkards. Now, isn't that a very good example? It's a very good example. What will we put in place of the palace? We will put the universe, or we will put the world, or we will put a human being, for example, or an animal in place of the palace. And then what does this notebook become? For example, let's match the palace with reality, right? We said the universe is the counterpart of the palace, or the earth, or all the animals, humans, all the works of art on earth. What does the notebook become? Is there such a notebook in this universe? They don't attribute it to God. God forbid. They attribute it to the notebook. What is that notebook then? Meaning it must be something they have given or believed in. Of course it can be. I mean, look at all of these one by one. It could be laws. Well, do these people write laws in such a notebook in the universe? For example, if we open a biology book or a botany book and open the page for a certain plant, does it describe how this plant comes into being? Yes, it talks about meiosis, mitosis. It explains. Does it describe the list of existing things? Its leaves are like this, its roots are like this. Then does it describe the law of administration? What enters from where? What exits from where? Does it describe it, for example, right? Look, all three are there. Or, for example, if we open a human anatomy textbook, can we see the organizational program there? How DNA pairs, how it divides, how it combines, how the first cell is created, how subsequent cells are created. Do they explain all the stages one by one? Last time there was a brother who is a biology teacher. We spent an hour or two together. I said, explain to me. I said, what happens in a cell? What goes on? I mean, of course, we don't know what happens. Explain for 15 to 20 minutes the organizational program. No, it comes from there, it goes from here. It brings this, it takes that, it takes it there, it brings it here. So they are laying it out as if they are workers working inside a building. They are learning the organizational program. They are learning the list of existing things. What is in the cell? What is in the human? Then how life continues, how vitality continues in the human. They explain the law of administration. Look, it's in that book, isn't it? If you asked how it rains, if you asked how the wind blows on earth, how the earth rotates, so a science has formed and is forming about everything. It says in the mechanism. So we can think of this book, this notebook, as sciences, as these three things found by sciences. So it's not a notebook anymore. This notebook is a representation. So people have discovered the organizational program, the list of existing things, and the laws of administration of these things, and the creatures in the universe. Science has found this. How does the universe turn? How does rain fall? How does the sun shine? I don't know. What happens? They have discovered God's manifestation there. They have found these three things. And then when you ask why this is happening like this, they say, well, this is the organizational program anyway. That's why it's like this. You ask why there are these things in it, they say this is the list of existing things anyway. They say, anyway, a human has these things. So why does this life continue like this? We have discovered this, they say. This is this law of administration, they say. We have observed thousands of people, they say, for example. This happens in all of them, they say. These are constant things. All three are constant things. So the person sees particles, atoms, things. Then at the second level, he discovers the constant in these things, meaning God's constant habit there. This time, for example, they find things that are the same in every human and are constantly the same. So here, the person finds something again. For example, in the previous second word, he finds the particle. That's easy. You just dismiss the unconscious particle and set it aside. In the third one, the person finds the organizational program. He finds that which is even less visible. So he finds the list of existing things. He finds the law, the cell. He finds all the organelles within the cell. He names them. He forms the organization. He finds them. Then he says, okay, I found it. He says, now, look, these are constant truths. Okay, brother? The things you found are constant truths. But these cannot be a master. These cannot be a maker. What you have found is something else. So it's not what you are looking for, but he says, I found this. So he says, I will say these things do it. So there is no notebook within the universe. But when we look at the entirety of the universe, when we take into account the existing things, these three things are observed. Now, whether you put this into a book or a notebook is something that comes out later. Whether you put it or not, we don't. But something like this forms in people's minds. For example, now, as I said, when I see an ear of corn, when I ask why it is yellow, I don't say God colored it yellow. God forbid I say corn is yellow anyway. Its leaves are green anyway, I say. It is like this anyway, I say. So what happens? It's as if knowing the things I know is sufficient. So as believers, while the disbeliever, the word wild comes into play there anyway. So the person doesn't even consider that the law is not the owner of power or even the owner of external existence. This is something relative. Despite this, he attributes it to it. The master points this out here. Okay, what you found is true, you have found it, but these cannot be something that replaces divine power. So he is doing something very good, and only to deceive. Look, to deceive, meaning what does it mean to deceive? For example, just when you are about to find the truth, it shows you something else. You then shift your focus to that side to deceive you. It explains the laws in such a way that it deceives you, and you think the law is doing it. So look, to deceive, I was amazed even by this word. So to deceive, these people have stopped and searched for themselves. How to deceive? Only to deceive by giving a name to some deep and important realities. They trivialize it as if that reality has been understood. You gave it a name, you named it. Okay, what I understood is this, he says. Its name is this, he says. The biology teacher, brother, says, for example, he calls DNA the manager molecule in the biology book. He says manager molecule, and when you read that, he says, well, it's already the manager, so it can do anything anyway. For example, transport RNA, carrier energy producing mitochondria. So they give such a name that whereas he says, that's just a carbon, hydrogen, oxygen atom, he says. The other one is a carbon atom. They are not different things, he says, but they give it such a name. Okay, this can do it now. Its name is this. It's deception. Only to deceive, by giving a name to some deep and important realities, they trivialize it as if that reality has been understood. For example, by saying this is electrical force. By saying this is electrical force, they make that subtle and deep reality insignificant and appear ordinary. Whereas the wisdoms of that miracle of power can only be expressed in 2 pages. By giving it a name, they obscure that reality and that universal wisdom, and substitute a very small and simple veil in its place, and attribute that miraculous work to blind force, to random chance, and to imagined nature. By attributing it to imagined nature, meaning each of these words is tremendous, by attributing it to imagined nature, they fall to a degree lower than Abu Jahl. For example, now a person says that a proton is positively charged, he says. An electron is negatively charged, he says. Opposite poles attract each other, he says. That's why, he says, the proton attracts the electron. So, for example, did you see the electron then? The electron is not something that has been seen yet. It's just land. They say there is something there. I mean, it's seen like that. How do you know about its positive and negative charge when you haven't even seen the electron? So what is this thing you call negative? Is there a minus sign on it? Or does it have a hat? What is this thing you call negative? What does negative charge mean? What is this thing called charge? For example, he says a proton is positively charged. He found a word. He says charge. Therefore, the proton is positively charged. So what is charged in the proton? What is this thing called charge? This is the name. Charge. Positive charge. Negative charge. He calls this positive, this negative. Then he says positive attracts negative. Then when it attracts, he says, didn't I tell you? Meaning it attracts because positive attracts negative. Therefore, so God forbid, there was no need for God's power. These two are already attracting each other anyway, a positive and a negative. So, God forbid. So we can explain it without saying God anyway. Okay, what is positive? What is negative? So the person thinks about it, and this is what happens. Now they see this attraction in between, because God's power manifests there. And this, he says, is considering force, which is a manifestation of power as a possessor of power and an independent possessor. Now there is a manifestation of power there. There is a manifestation of power that holds the proton and electron together. This is the result. What could be the cause of this? He says, let me think of a cause for this. Meaning, let me give an explanation for this, he says. He says, if I invent something called positive charge and negative charge, and call this positive and this negative, I will have provided a good philosophical explanation for this, he says. And then he invents something like this. Then he believes it himself. He believes it himself. So that last, have you seen the proton now? Number. Have you seen the electron? Number. Have you seen something called positive charge on the proton? Number. What is it? What is the essence of this thing called charge? You haven't even understood the essence of the proton. So how can you understand the essence of the charge on it? Have you seen the electron? Number, you say the electron is negatively charged. What is that? Is it an apple, a pear, an onion, a potato? What kind of a thing is it? That's not there either. In fact, physicists say this. Physics, they say, sees according to theory. We see the results. And we invent a model based on those results. They say the best model invented so far is this, so we teach this. Tomorrow, another physicist might come along and say, this invented thing doesn't fully explain. For example, there was an atom model that we studied before. They threw it in the trash. Now they are working on another atom model. If a higher one comes, they say, if it provides a better explanation, we will accept it, they say. They say it themselves. They say these are not proven, seen things. I'm not saying this. This is not my word. It's the word of physicists. They say that such a force of attraction between proton and electron is not something that has been seen. And they say that the law of gravitational attraction between two objects, such a force has not been observed. We only see the attraction. We don't want to say this attraction is a manifestation of God's power. To explain this attraction with the nature of that thing, we attribute such a thing to their nature, their essence. That is, we define such a thing. And then we attribute it to its nature, he says. Did you see it? Number. Did you observe it? Number. But he says, if I invent it like this, he says it fits perfectly. He says, for example, in fact, it will be a bit, but it's beneficial to know, for example, in the 1600s, Newton said there is a force of attraction between masses. Two objects attract each other, he says. That's why he says objects remain connected to each other. For example, in the 1900s, Einstein came and said, this is a ridiculous thing, he says. How will it attract, he says. I mean, something needs to extend from here to there, he says. It needs to affect it, he says. Is such a thing visible? He says that a force that is not even visible, can it be the owner of force? This is ridiculous, he says. Then he says there is space-time curvature. Due to space-time curvature, objects move towards each other. For example, he says if you place a mass on a sheet, it creates a depression. If you place something there, it goes towards it, he says. For example, he explains something like this. For example, they believe in this. They abandon that. Another physicist comes. He says something else. So what is said is not seen. For example, I see the table now. I say this is a table. What is presented for it is force, charge. These are not seen things. There is such a result. According to this result, what kind of thing should we attribute to objects? Meaning, what charge should we give it so that it gives this result? They are doing philosophy, meaning they are giving names. Now he says, I call this positive. I call this negative. And then he says, if I say opposites attract, okay? He says, I have explained the matter, he says. Then someone will come and refute this and then put something else. So for the master to say this back in the 1900s, to see this game, to just notice and point out this word game, isn't it something truly remarkable? What kind of contemplation, what kind of mind? He is breaking their game. There's a chemistry department at METU. They bring a stone to the chemistry department. They say this is, so a person comes as a customer. I have such a stone, he says. I want to process this stone, he says. Produce acid for me to pierce this stone, he says. I will shape it, process it, make art, etc. So in order to be able to shape it to, okay, they say, we'll do it. Go and come back in 6 months, they say. Let's examine the stone. Let's see what's in the stone. Let's find out which acid will pierce it, and so on, they say. We can't tell you immediately, they say. Look at the chemistry department, how many professors, how much experience they have. They will examine the stone. They will discover the acid, according to the stone, the appropriate acid for it. They will find it, tell you, etc. Now, when a plant root comes and sees that stone, does it say, let me go and get this stone analyzed? Which acid should I pour on this? And then leave and go to the university? Does it get the stone analyzed? That's a separate stage. Okay, you got the stone analyzed. You found which acid it needs. How will you make this acid? How will you make the acid? How will you make it? If it's not acid, what will it burn? It will produce this acid in a way that won't harm itself. That's a separate stage. Here, a sophistry is being done. Demagoguery is being done. For example, what does Bismillah mean? First, one needs to understand that. For example, how does he give the example of Bismillah there? Just as if I saw a single man come and gather the whole city's family and make them work in military camps. You know with certainty that that man is not acting in his own name or with his own strength. Perhaps he is a soldier. He acts in the name of the state. He is supported by a power. So a person is seen. One person is doing the work of 1,000 people. This is the observation. There is a man with the strength of one person, but he is seen doing a work that 1,000 people can do. From this, it is understood that he is not doing this work, but there is an army behind him, he says. This is a very good logic. This is our basic principle anyway. That is, the causes are apparent. Since that apparent cause is not a cause that can match the result, we now see the real cause as apparent. I always give the example of the pen. I like it very much too. You write with a pen. Who writes the visible writing? The tip of the pen writes, that is. But who is writing in reality? There is someone behind the pen holding the pen. Now, if that person drops the pen, can the pen write the same writing? Look, the pen seems to be writing. We contemplate there, we say. We are contemplating. We say, look, this is a very beautiful writing, a writing that requires knowledge. Is this pen knowledgeable? Number, is it powerful? Number. Even though it seems to be writing in appearance, in reality it is not writing. Causes are like that too. In appearance, causes seem to be immediately at work, in charge. But when we look at the work done, and the cause, the result, the work done is infinite and requires infinite knowledge, the cause doesn't have that. So we say this visible thing, then there is a power governing this, there is a knowledge governing this. Okay, there is acid at the tip of the root. Who put that acid there? There is a knowledge here. There is knowledge to make that acid. There is knowledge to prefer it, and so on. There is. There is. Is this knowledge in this acid? Is it in this root? Number. So in appearance, this is doing it. Then there is someone who possesses knowledge and power governing here. Because this root shows that saying Bismillah means in meaning, I am not doing this. This is not my work. There is a being who is governing me right now. This means it is his work anyway. Otherwise, it's not like saying Bismillah and picking up a rosary. It's not like that. There's the matter of the language of disposition, isn't there? It says Bismillah with the language of disposition. That pen says with the language of disposition, I am not writing this. That thing there, so when the person sees that, he says, look, there's acid here, it's piercing. He says, look, exactly like this man. Okay, look, a soldier came and mobilized the whole city's family. Look, you saw it. Okay, look, the soldier is doing it, he says. Don't you see, he says, look, the soldier is doing it. Yes, the eye sees the art, the mind sees the artist. What your eye sees is true, this is. But won't I verify it? Won't I see the equivalence between cause and effect? For example, a knife cuts. It always gives potato, the knife is making food. Now, is the knife making the food? It appears to be, but there is something governing it, meaning a hidden, unseen power is in control of every particle. We understand that from the relationship between cause and effect. So everything it says in the 14th thing, was it the 17th lemma? Everything he says by doing work thousands of times beyond its capacity testifies to the all-powerful being. By doing work thousands of times beyond its capacity, the effects, the logic is always the same. So why do we say apparent cause, real cause? Apparent is something seen. But the visible cause does not explain us. For example, let me give another political and social example. A person commits a crime or does something, he puts someone in between, for example. The incident is very complex, the police say, these people can't think of this, they say. So many things. There is another network behind this, they say, for example. Why? Meaning the result of that action, the activity is very organized. This is organized. He says it's fine. Meaning these people cannot think of these things. So there is a network behind it, he says. The person finds the network, for example. Look, the mind is working here. And here, look, the stone is being pierced. The stone is being pierced. Currently, people are making a lot of noise to pierce a stone. Haven't we been able to do the same? Like the roots? produce acid. And with acid, look, roots are technologically superior to us right now. So right now we are still drilling with a drill. Either plants are smarter and more capable than us, or we will have to say that we are more deaf than them. So that second example, that thing you gave, finishes it completely. Hopefully my intention was to read both of them, but I think we will only finish the first one. These kinds of things are fully resolved by these two examples. And then there is the cause at the very end. The cause of the causes is results. For example, there he says, just as Allah creates the results, causes and natures cannot do it. He says there is a creator of the cause of nature too. He fundamentally connects it there. For example, who is piercing the stone now? We say Allah is piercing it. The root cannot pierce, that cannot pierce, this cannot pierce. We are actually explaining that. And after showing that they cannot pierce it, then the one who pierces the stone is Allah. And the one who created that root is Allah. He is using it there as a veil of cause, he says. And then that comes, of course, as a chain fundamentally, and things are now firmly connected there. Because when we say the root cannot pierce, okay, it cannot pierce, but then the person asks why it exists there, since it has no function. That also needs to be explained. That's why the area of nature proceeds in a chain. For example, I saw that in this reading of mine. There is a consistency from beginning to end. There is a wholeness. There is a very tremendous wholeness. When you read it again and again, that becomes visible. God shows it. For example, let me read this part now. By hiding that universal wisdom and substituting a very small and simple veil in its place, and attributing that miraculous work to blind force, to random chance, and to imagined nature, they fall to a degree lower than Abu Jahl. Lower than Abu Jahl, as I mentioned before. So the Abu Jahls worship idols. These also worship stones, worship soil, worship wood. So what does he do? He says, we have our idols. He says, let's protect our idols. He says, look, our idols, he says, put our idols forward. Let's do it, he says. Right? What does he do? He says, these protect us. He says, these protect us. He says, these, well, you say this is wood. Don't look at it as wood, he says. It has mysterious powers, he says. What does it do to us? It makes us believe it. It's the same here. He says, don't look at its nature. He says, that it's stone and soil. Nature does it, he says. For example, God forbid, or laws are like this, etc. So what does he do? He attributes something that doesn't exist. There is still wood there, but what is non-existent is the mysterious power of the wood. But by repeatedly saying it to you, he makes you believe in it. Look, it's an imagined thing. Does the wood have its thing? Does the wood have mysterious power? Number, it's an imagined thing, meaning a person only imagines it. There is no such thing. But he places it in people's imagination and makes them believe. These people also attribute such power to nature, chance, particles, atoms, law. They make them conceive it. They make them believe. And then they say, look, these do it. For example, they have the capacity to do it. And then people believe it. I mentioned before, imagined nature. So the things they attribute to things and make others believe actually don't have such properties. For example, proton, electron don't have such a force of attraction. They don't have such a property. In their essence, they don't have such a property. They make one imagine that it has such a property. Once that property is accepted, there's nothing left to say it attracts anyway. But first he makes them imagine it. Why does he make them imagine it there? Divine power manifests, he says. Attraction occurs. It has happened already. There is an attraction there. He says the atom attracts. Did you see the atom attracting? Number? Did you see the force with the atom? Number, on what basis are you saying this? On what basis are you saying this? You haven't seen anything. Why are you saying it? Right? Have you seen the proton? Number, have you seen the electron? Number, have you seen the force between them? Number, have you observed that they possess force? Do you know what force is? Number, how can you say something about something you haven't seen? You are making a claim. This is for deceiving. If I don't say this, he says, then everyone will say God. Then he says, no one will believe in these particles, he says. Then everyone will understand that particles cannot do it, he says. But if I say things like this, I say, then everyone will believe it, he says. After that, the rest is easy, he says. From there onwards, they build the palace of the universe. The first thing we will do with atheists is to first take that force away from the proton and electron. After that, the job is done. After that, you can say goodbye. So it comes by itself, and these people take it. So they fall to a degree lower than Abu Jahl, thus to one of the laws of God's habits, which are the titles of divine will and laws, to the essence of that law, which human beings cannot know due to their inability, to the essence of that law of attraction. They give the name electricity. Look how clear and precise, isn't it? Due to human inability, not knowing the essence of that law of attraction, they give it the name electricity and say it's electricity. Ah, you say it's electricity. It wasn't electricity. The name came. By giving it the name electricity and trivializing the wonderful miracle of power and illumination. What's so special about this? He says. Look, it's that simple. I explained it, and by giving it a name like electrical force as if it's something known, they ignorantly trivialize many such wonderful miracles of divine power. For example, I found the meaning expressed by this note in Sunniya and also in Asar-e-Bediye, and then 2 short paragraphs. Shall I read that too? They are very original expressions. Look, Asar-e-Bediye 7:587. Giving a name sometimes replaces knowing the thing itself. Musemma, he says. That is the substance, the atom, the proton, its positive charge, negative charge, etc., attraction, the law of attraction. Giving a name sometimes replaces knowing the thing itself. When you give it a name, it's as if you know it. It creates a dark light, a luminous darkness in current thoughts. It turns simple ignorance into compound ignorance. The person didn't know before. It was simple ignorance. He gave it a name. He learned, right? It became compound ignorance. Not knowing. For example, compound ignorance is not knowing that one doesn't know. Now the person also thinks he knows. It's many layers of ignorance. The person used to say, why does the atom proton attract? I don't know, he says. This is ignorance. Now it has a positive charge, a negative charge, etc., etc. He doesn't know. He knows some things he thinks he knows. He also doesn't know that he doesn't know. He thinks he knows, so it turns into compound ignorance. He says when a name is given, it's harder to translate this. The most important reason is to give a bright name to an unknown thing, and to think that one has known this unknown reality with this. to refer other unknown things to it and think that one has explained them, he thinks. Whereas description is either by drawing or by picturing. Otherwise, it is not with the inert name whose maker is ignorant. One aspect is attractive. It does not resemble the named thing. Its dark aspect is obscured. Its prominent aspect is bright and transparent. With that name, neither is anything described, nor is it worthy of explanation. For example, it perhaps deceives the mind. General attraction, magnetic force, electrical force, telepathy, also vibration, magnetism, etc. Names like attraction and pull. This passes through Asar-e-Bediyya. There is a similar passage in Sunniyat. So he says these are putting words, right? I understand, brother. What you call electrical force is not something that exists. It is not an entity belonging to things. It is a manifestation of divine power's manifestation there. Of course, then, for example, the example of the sun and the moon shows this well. For example, we pointed a mirror at the sun. The mirror shines. It shines like the sun, right, brother? For example, now this needs to be explained. What is this brightness? If one said it is a manifestation, a reflection of the sun there, the matter would be resolved. But to avoid saying that, he says this is the property of the moon. The moon shines, the mirror shines, he says. That is in the mirror. This brightness is in the nature, the essence of the mirror, he says. So what need is there for the sun if the mirror is shining, brother, right? There is a result here from the mirror, he says. Well, we can understand that it's not from the mirror, that the mirror, brother, the master says, is a very thin thing. How can it contain the sun inside, he says. For example, what does he do? We can understand that it's not in the mirror, but we say it's the sun. But similarly, in the atom, in the particle, in the proton, etc., there is no infinite power, no power like that. But now the person has said positive and negative. And then he attributes a force to them that attracts. And then it's over. So for the master to say this back then, reading something like this made me very happy. I said, mashallah. For him to immediately extract and say where this thing is done. Unfortunately, for example, nowadays, among people who do not read the Risale-i Nur, the person tries to prove the existence of God by saying the proton and electron attract, he says. So, for example, the person already has a problem with his own faith. Most people, for example, there is nothing outside the Risale-i Nur that teaches these points. So in other words, there is no one other than the master who brings these points and carries the matter all the way to these points of Tawheed. But brother, the master has put this in the realm of nature. It needs to be understood. So he has put the examples here the most, meaning the biggest examples. So they found a formula for giving it. So what shall we do, they said. Let's invent something called positive. Let's invent something called negative. Anyway, it's not written on it, or you can't go and look at their forehead anyway. And then they said, we will do philosophy for the rest. They said they would solve this matter like this. Really, can a person solve this on their own? What can something called charge be? Positive charge. What can its net be? Meaning proton. Okay. What can its charge be? Right? I mean, and it's a ridiculous thing. Just a name. Why is he giving such a name? To be able to give an explanation there. And then people believe it. That's how it goes. Let me read the place in Sunnah too. The most important reason that turns simple ignorance into compound ignorance in present thoughts, a dark light, a luminous darkness, is to think one has understood something by giving a bright name to an unknown thing, and to think one has explained unknown things by referring them to that. He says negative, he says. He attributes the attraction to it too. To think one has explained by referring them to it, whereas description is either by drawing or by picturing. It is by drawing and picturing. That is, you either draw it or depict it, meaning you show it, what it is, what it looks like. There is no such thing. Can you draw and show the positive and negative charge like this? It looks like this, it looks like that. There is no such thing. They say it themselves anyway. For example, they say force cannot be seen, and they say such a force has not been observed. They say this themselves. But this theory explains it, he says, for example. It is explained with this theory. Therefore, he says, we accept this theory for now. If another physicist comes and provides a better explanation, we will accept that, he says. So the results are seen. For example, how do we find God now? There is a result like the universe. There is a result like this, or there is a result like a human being. There is a work. For this work, infinite knowledge and power are needed, we say. We say there must be a being who is the owner of knowledge and power. Since nothing in the universe is the owner of infinite knowledge and power, we say this being is outside the universe. This is how we briefly prove God. So there are such people. They say, let's invent something else without mentioning God, they say. Let's invent the theory of evolution. Let's invent some other theory. We will explain it that way, they say. But in the end, the theory they rely on is either based on matter or, let's say, on the nature of matter. Since matter itself is unconscious, it cannot be attributed to matter. The master shows this. What is called nature is also divided into two. The master says, if you are going to attribute it to the nature of matter, it is there anyway. You have to accept infinite knowledge and power in the nature of matter, he says. If you don't show infinite knowledge and power in the nature of matter, you still cannot explain it with nature. Suppose you showed knowledge and power. That's still not enough, he says. Because all particles will be similar to each other, he says. There will still be chaos, he says. Since it must be one, it still won't work, he says, because the Sultan of the universe must be one. If you attribute it to particles, it becomes multitude. It still won't work, he says. No matter what you do, it won't work, he says. This struggle continues, yet description is either by drawing or by picturing. Otherwise, it is not with an inert name whose maker is ignorant and which resembles the named thing. Its dark aspect is obscured, and its prominent aspect is bright and transparent, like magnetism, telepathy, force, magnetic force, etc. So what does the master connect the notebook part to? So it's exactly like this example. Just like this example. A wild man carrying the idea of naturalism that leads to the denial of divinity enters this palace of the universe, which is infinitely more regular, more perfect than the palace in the example, and whose surroundings are filled with miraculous wisdom. Just like this example, a wild man carrying the idea of naturalism that leads to the denial of divinity enters this palace of the universe, which is infinitely more regular, more perfect than the palace in the example, and whose surroundings are filled with miraculous wisdom. Without thinking that it is the work of the necessary being, who is outside the realm of possibilities, and by turning away from him, he sees a collection of laws of divine habits and an index of divine. art, which is like a writing board of divine destiny within the realm of possibilities, and which can be subject to change and alteration in the execution of divine power's laws, and which is very wrongly and mistakenly called nature. And he says, what did he see? What did he see? So what do these people see? What was the last word, brother? Collection. Yes, from the last word, he sees a collection of laws of divine habits, an index of divine art. So there is something they see. People see something. The person says, science doesn't say God. He says, ignorant people, primitive people, people who can't think like this, who can't understand something like this, said God. He says, we're not God, God forbid. So people look like this. Of course you need it. He says, you're afraid of death. He says, you need immortality, etc. So the person sees saying God as something, they sigh and say God. So that's why he doesn't consider that possibility at all. The person, when he says God, he steps out of science, he steps outside of science. So the person eliminates that option. Whereas without mentioning God, nothing can be explained. Nothing in the universe has the nature to explain anything else. He says nothing is something that can convince the mind, that can please the mind. Nothing can see it. What is truly great is this is where our Master's greatness comes into play. The Master has explained and expressed this, and by God's grace, he has made a large portion of humanity believe in it and made them cherish these works. The Master has achieved this by God's grace. For example, saying God is greatness, saying God is intelligence, saying God is a necessary thing, most fitting to reality. So he has explained that. He has revealed that what they call science, what they call nature, are superstitious things. Alhamdulillah. If not, we wouldn't even be able to talk about these things anyway. Let alone our state, we wouldn't even be able to get into a state where we could talk about and understand these things anyway. So, if it weren't for the Master, he explains what they call nature, what they call causes, what they call this, what they call that. So, the best way to solve something is, what do you say, brother? You say nature. Look, this is nature. Look again. Can these things do it? You look. Let me tell you what nature is, he says. After this, you think again. Then the person will say, well, the nature you mentioned is this. Then he will say, I was believing in something absurd. Then he will say, okay, what I found is correct, but this is not something I can attribute the universe to. So the person, he says science, he says age, he says whatever. He never falls to the place we mentioned. Thank God, because you have solved the matter. Everything is clear. So they see a collection of laws of divine habits. So they see the laws of divine habits that God puts into effect in the universe. These are the truths that science has found. He has found them. Okay, what you have found is true, but what is wrong? This is a notebook that is subject to change and alteration in the execution of divine power's laws. That is, Allah creates a human in the womb through meiosis and mitosis. Could he not have created it in another way? For example, when a person builds this building, what does he do? He lays the foundation, he does such and such. Could he not have done it in another way? He could have, for example, brought ready-made parts and put them together. He could have dropped them from the sky too. So this is a habit. They have adopted it. They found it the most wise and did that. This is the preference of the doer. It is also the preference of God, the laws of science. Allah creates humans and animals in this way. That is, He creates them by this method. This can change in other ways. That is, there is no such thing as it cannot change. For example, let's say positive attracts negative. Allah can also make it repel. These depend on what Allah says, on what He wills. These can change, because it's not something that originates from the nature of matter. It's something that originates from God's will. How will manifest? Now the electron turns around the atom. Allah puts the electron there. He can do that. Allah can change this. Because why? This is God's habit by will. Can't a person change their habit? You say, from now on, I will do it like this, and it changes. But how do they explain those laws? They explain laws as unchangeable. They say laws don't change as long as God doesn't change them. When He changes them, they change. Why? Because laws are divine habits. They are God's habit in creating the universe. He creates every human in the same way. As a habit, for example, not you differently and me differently. We are all created through meiosis and mitosis. This is His habit. The person finds this. He says, how does a human exist? Well, he exists through meiosis and mitosis. What you have found is not the one who makes the human. You are finding the habit of the one who makes the human. He brings that habit and presents it to us as power. What I'm asking is something else. Your answer is something else. Isn't it true? He asks. Isn't there meiosis and mitosis? He asks. Yes, there is, that's true. But I'm asking you about the maker. He has committed demagoguery there. What the master calls wild is that he cannot distinguish between these two, meaning he cannot distinguish between law and power. Yes, brother, a collection of laws of divine habits and an index of divine art. And he says, since this thing requires a cause, nothing appears as related as this notebook. Although reason does not accept in any way that this notebook, being eyeless, unconscious, and powerless. Look, the master immediately points out what? Eyeless, unconscious, powerless, he says. Meaning he is defining the essence of nature. Look, he hears this. So you cannot attribute it to this, he says. Meaning he says, eyeless, unconscious, powerless. He says this cannot be the master anymore. Look, he defines it with 3 words and finishes the job. This notebook, being eyeless, unconscious, and powerless, performs the act of creation, which is the work of absolute lordship and requires infinite power. But since I do not accept the eternal maker, I will say that the most suitable is to say that this notebook has done it, will do it, and does it. We also say, let's read this part too if you want. O most foolish of fools, O drunkard who has persisted in foolishness, lift your head out of the swamp of nature, look behind you. See a maker of majesty, to whom all beings from particles to planets testify with separate tongues and point with their fingers. See the manifestation of the eternal engraver who wrote the palace's program in the notebook. Adhere to his command. Listen to his Quran. Get rid of those ravings.